Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elected representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Jeff Dubrow.
Welcome to episode 16 of Politics and Public Finance. Feels like yesterday I was sitting there wondering how I was going to get this show going. Then I found Taz, wonderful podcast producer at Huge Impact Marketing, and the rest is history. We're up to episode number 16. A really fascinating guest today, Don Bowser, who has been across Ukraine supporting the country pretty much since the beginning of the Russian invasion. He is a Canadian living in the same province as myself. I'm here in New Brunswick. He's just returned from Ukraine and has amazing perspectives to share. So let's get right to the interview with Don Bowser. Don Bowser, welcome back to Canada. Great to have you back in one piece.
Great, thanks, Jeff.
How was your trip to Ukraine? Tell us all about it.
Well, which trip? I've left Canada in the second week of the war in early March and deployed myself to the Polish-Ukrainian border. First week was involving some rescue missions, and then for the next 4 months, I was delivering non-lethal military supplies to special forces units inside Ukraine. So basically procuring and then hand delivering the equipment to specific units. And then for the last couple of months, I've been focused very much on helping frontline communities do early recovery work that are recently liberated in the Chernihiv area, Kharkiv, and we've been looking at the Kiev region as well, and Sumy. So it's been very different experiences in all of those. When I first went in, it was the end of March. So the city still had some active fighting, but Russian forces were withdrawing. So it was very much a different place. It was an armed camp in which your documents were checked at every corner. I was detained once by the intelligence service for simply photographing the building in which I used to live. So you very much felt that, and the city was empty, and so you very much felt the war. Fast forward a couple of months later, and it's hipsters on e-scooters riding around, going to their favorite cafes and hanging out, and you wouldn't know that the war was on. So very different experiences in terms of where you are, how close to the line of contact you are, and things like that.
That's incredible. And you feel a lightness in Kiev, in the capital. More recently, now that I guess the Russians have never made it to Kiev, you feel sort of a more lightness of being there in that city?
Well, even after, even in the later part of April, you wouldn't feel that the war was on at all, except for the air raids. So we've had a couple of missile strikes. So me and the whole family moved there for the last couple of months, and except for the occasional air raid alert and things like that and the precautions that you need to take, you don't really feel that the war is touching you. But then you go to a place like Kharkiv, which is under daily rocket attack, and the outlying communities, which are under artillery attacks, and which a number of times we tried to enter communities, but were turned back at checkpoints simply because it was too dangerous. So you would come in just after the artillery had ended, and there's still buildings burning and rubble smoldering in certain places. So there are many different realities. There are some communities which have never been hit. Some now only because the infrastructure is being targeted by the Russians that you feel it. But there are. It's not like in any other war, and this is my fifth war. Is that it's not all war all the time everywhere, and so it's very different experiences in terms of where you are and how close you are to the line of contact. In the case of Ukraine, there is no real safe places except for Chernihiv, which has never been hit. Outside of that, every community has had some sort of level of attack, but the realities are very different.
How did you decide? I mean, you were all over the country. every time I would check Facebook, you would be in a different spot. And I'm obviously not asking you to reveal your positions, but how did you decide where to travel and when?
Well, it's dictated by the operational needs. No, I have no problem telling where I've been. I just never would reveal where I was at a specific time.
Right.
After you leave a
Right.
location, you're fine to disclose. And I know a lot of people, you'd ask them where they are, and they would say, I can't tell you, it's operational security, which is nonsense. Once you've left a location, then there is no physical danger to you in revealing where you were. So that's how you can spot the people who are pretending. The live action role players, we call them, the LARPers, who walk around in Kiev dressed up in uniform. And when you ask them where they were or where they saw action, they told you they couldn't tell you. And then you'd sit in a bar with the guys who have been
Right.
fighting for the last 5 months, and they're eagerly exchanging Google Maps positions of where their trenches had been and things like that. So how did I decide? Well, I mean, it's just what's needed. So I was procuring and delivering directly to military units. So you basically have to either drop things off on the other side of the border or in Lviv, depending if the driver was available to take it forward, or if it was sensitive equipment, then you have to hand deliver it yourself, which means going the journey into Kiev, usually. But the rest of my work in terms of doing frontline communities is going where the need is the most. And currently that need is outside of Kiev region, mostly in Chernihiv and Kharkiv especially. And now it'll be further south in the Kharkiv region that have been just recently liberated. So it's going where the need is.
What was the morale like there in Kharkiv and in the environs?
Depends where. I mean, the morale in the communities that are getting shelled, who do you see left? It's people who have no place to go. So you would meet with mostly elderly people who didn't have any place to go, didn't want to escape to
Leave their
another
home,
country or
yeah.
to Western Ukraine. So morale universally is high. Nobody is willing to make any compromises with the occupying forces. So now, really, the basic attitude is we have to finish this war. So, rarely do you talk to people who are suffering any sort of major depression or anything else. It's more anger than anything that's driving people in a lot of places. The further you get away from the line of contact, the different the attitudes are. I mean, it's been 6 months now, so people have suspended their lives and to do everything. And the relief efforts are largely being driven by Ukrainian volunteers. So it's Ukrainians who are delivering the assistance that people need. The international organizations have been extremely slow, and still after 6 months are very much inefficient in terms of their deliveries. So most people are not depending on the international community. In fact, there's a lot of animosity towards the international community, and why this conflict is so unique that they cannot perform the functions that they perform in other places. You have floods in Pakistan, the next day they're out there. You have a war in Afghanistan, yet people can deploy in Afghanistan. But for some reason, uniquely in the case of Ukraine, the international organizations have been so risk adverse and unable to field themselves, especially in the forward positions.
What are the one or two things that really struck you during your visit to Ukraine? And I realize you were there for a long time, and you've got a contrast between the beginning of the war, when I guess there was a sentiment that Russia was going to quickly overtake the country, to now where there's some jubilation. But what are some of the key things you bring back where you just say, I really didn't see that coming, or that really shocked me?
Yeah, I mean, after you've been in a conflict, I mean, most conflicts are fairly similar in terms of how horrid they are. What was surprising? Again, the most surprising thing is that immediately, as soon as the danger's gone, people just forget there's a war on. That struck me the most. I remember the first time I went into Lviv, and people were just dancing on the streets and enjoying themselves and whatever else. And that incredible amount of anger you have is that they just don't seem to understand that people are dying on the front lines. And it was exactly the same situation in 2014, 2015, 2016. Yeah. Conflict was on and nobody seemed to know. Later on in the conflict, it's clear it's dragged on for a long time. People tend to forget. But when it was still hot, it was the same. Kiev didn't know that there was fighting in the east. And so you see this contrast between people who are living under daily indirect fire attacks and the randomness also of it. So you go to a place like Irpin and Bucha, and one apartment is completely fine. The next apartment got a missile strike and is completely burnt out. So that randomness of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time struck me about how people could be living in their apartment and next door there's nothing. The resilience, of course, of Ukrainians and being able to go back and putting back their lives. And that's what they want the most, is just to be able to provide for themselves. Because the international community has failed in terms of delivering sufficient humanitarian aid, most people understand that they need to provide for themselves. So that means that they need to be able to go back to work and they need to be able to earn an income. There's plenty of food in Ukraine, but it costs. So you need to have some sort of income to be able to afford it. It's going to be very difficult this winter in terms of heating, but in terms of other things, people really just need to go back to earning their own keep, and they want to rebuild their lives. And that resiliency is extremely striking. I look at how much Canada fell apart during a simple thing like the pandemic, in which people were so terrified, and still the fear that they have now. And you compare that to the 90-year-old grandmother who is on the front lines in Kharkiv and just going about her daily life.
Well, it's all relative. We all have, we can only deal with the reality that we live in. But I think one of the stories that maybe is a story that didn't really make the news out here in Canada or in the West was the story of the humanitarian aid, because of course we know the saga or the story of the military aid, that it was slow in coming, but that Ukraine has received new weapons, including HIMARS, which have really helped them to turn the tide. But from what I'm hearing, this is the first I hear that the humanitarian aid that was required to help Ukraine cope with the war situation wasn't provided in a timely manner.
No, it's been discussed many, many times. It's just people don't like to tell that bad news story. But the fact is, the Ukrainians have reported on it extremely often. Everybody else who's been there. So for the first 3 months of the war, you did not see any international organizations outside of World Central Kitchen and some of the faith-based organizations like Caritas. Those are the only people, not even on the Polish border, could somehow international NGOs and the international community, including the Red Cross and the UN, seem to be able to deploy themselves. UNHCR, for example, in the largest crossing point at Medica, had an empty tent, which I photographed. There was nothing inside it. So you would see refugees coming and they would simply pass through this. But when there was a photo opportunity, that was the one that pictures were taken. So people have reported on it. But the problem with most of the Western news agencies is that they, of course, have to give people a chance to present their view, and there was always a litany of excuses. But there's a very good report out by a British NGO called Humanitarian Outcomes that details exactly how much assistance was given. Ukrainian organizations did the bulk of the humanitarian assistance, and they received less than 1% of the funding available. So it's all detailed. Everybody's knowing it. The international organizations knew it. And that's why they were in a huge panic, because their delivery rates are so low and the money that they've collected. So I've detailed it on every single media event that I've done. I can't even remember how many times I've been on the media in the last 6 months, maybe 50 times. And I always detail it. And many of the other people who are on the ground detail it. But
and you started your own recovery organization.
Yeah, so that's why we shouldn't be doing this. So I teamed up together with the former first deputy governor of Donetsk region, Yevgeny Volinsky, and we formed an organization to start to do early recovery work simply because it wasn't being done. So now the humanitarian aid machine is running, but it comes in insufficient quantities and irregularly. So the real need now is in terms of getting early recovery and stabilization. this is the work that should be done by big organizations, but it wasn't being done. So myself and somebody who ran Donetsk region for the first 5 years of the war teamed up simply because we knew that this needed to be done and somebody needed to do it. It's been incredibly hard to get funding because the choice for most funders is to give it to already existing big organizations,
Sure.
irregardless of their ability to deliver. So Ukrainian organizations, which are small, most of them recently established because there wasn't a large need for humanitarian organizations in Ukraine, are newly established, and they haven't been able to access the funds which go to larger organizations who are simply sitting on the resources.
How do you measure the sorry to interrupt, Don, how do you measure the extent of the humanitarian catastrophe or situation, if it's not a catastrophe, that's currently playing there? How do you mix sort of the war situation with the lack of food and the destruction that's taken place?
Well, there's different ways. Both the World Bank are working on this and the Kiev School of Economics in terms of measuring the actual physical destruction to buildings within it. Right. So right now we're about the 50 billion mark in terms of immediate repairs and things that need to be done. There's a much greater dimension to this that's going to blow up, and we're looking at the Ukrainian government predicts about 700 billion is needed to fully recover at the moment. So there are ways to measure this. There's ways to measure needs. We do our own needs assessment. So we developed our own methodology in terms of how we do that, doing key informant interviews and things like that in terms of getting people to tell exactly what their needs are. And that's been one of the problems as well, is that people come in with preset concepts that this is allowable or this is not allowable or this is what we need to do. So, for example, in some of the towns around Kharkiv, they were getting supplies delivered for 5-member families, including small children. Well, small children are not there. There are very few of the families that are 5 people, right? So what you have is not the quantity or the products necessary, because nobody's done a needs assessment. They just do their standard off-the-shelf things and deliver whatever they have instead of what is needed. So there isn't an effective needs assessment system in place. Local communities themselves are not prepared for this. This is why we tried to bring the experience of Lugansk and Donetsk regions that did this for 8 years. But it's been extremely difficult to make other regions understand that experience is directly relevant to what they're going through, because that's the way it was in the first 8 years of the war.
But what examples of human suffering did you witness that really strike you?
Well, a lot of people have been killed. The smell of burnt human flesh and decaying bodies under rubble is not something that you easily forget.
No.
The towns outside of Kiev that were devastated, the towns outside of Kharkiv and around, which are devastated, and the level of terror that has gone on under occupation. Everybody's focused on a place like Bucha. Bucha is minor in comparison to what we're going to find in some of the other occupied communities that were occupied for 6 months. So the endless list of war crimes and what cluster munitions do to any inhabited space, or a place like Saltiv outside of Kharkiv, which was one of the biggest, densest populated communities in Ukraine and is completely devastated by endless rounds of artillery and cluster munitions coming in. So, I mean, that level of destruction to see in the 21st century, and this is nothing like Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else, our collective experience for the last 75 years pales in comparison to the level of destruction that's going on in Ukraine.
Do you have any estimate of the number of civilian deaths in Ukraine since the Russian invasion on February 24th of this year?
No, there's a lot of numbers that have been bandied around. The problem is that the people like the organization Truth Hounds, which does this documentation of war crimes, are so completely underfunded and undermanned that they have a real problem keeping accurate counts of this. The Ukrainian government has put out numbers, but they themselves don't have the ability to go into occupied territories to have any sort of accurate. It's only now that we see in Mariupol, you start to get numbers. So in Mariupol, at least 1/10 of the population has been killed. So you're looking at 50,000 there. So probably across the country, we're going to see several 100,000 people have been killed. There are numbers that are published by the prosecutor's office in Ukraine and other people, but the level of accuracy of these right now is very difficult, simply because you have to have access to be able to understand. In terms of the Ukrainian losses in the armed forces, it's very high. And this has been a tremendously horrific casualty rate over the last 3 months.
And when you include the armed forces, are you talking about civilians who have taken up arms as well? Are you including those in the calculation?
No, there's not really that civilians. I mean, in the early days in the defense of Kiev, people were given guns to defend, but everybody else, Ukraine now has a 1 million person army. So it's about 1 million. About 50,000 of those are women that are currently on the front lines. So you're looking at 1 million people. I mean, it's people who have volunteered, but everybody is legitimately within the armed forces. But there are a number of non-state groups. But outside of that, it's the armed forces of Ukraine. And they're the ones that are fighting. They're the ones that are paying the price. I mean, a lot of talk has been simply because the Ukrainians don't want to reveal their losses too much, and they don't want to reveal operational needs, is that there's been a huge amount of focus on Western weapons and Westerners who are fighting. But the reality is the Ukrainian show. The Russian army was defeated in March by Ukrainians in Kiev without any largely Western weapons except for javelins that had been delivered. That was it. So everything else since then, all of these wonder weapons that have been delivered are great. They help, but it's very small scale, right? HIMARS is what, maybe 30 at most that are deployed out of a million-person army. So this is largely and predominantly a Ukrainian fight, and it's just that the Western assistance gets a lot of attention, but that's not the reality on the ground.
How large was the army on February 24th? You said it's up to a million people now.
Yeah, it was about 200,000.
How on earth can you mobilize an army like that? Even over a 6-month period, isn't that probably unprecedented in the world?
Yes, and this is why when people talk about the supply chain issues and stuff, there are a lot of problems in terms of the supply chain. But the reality is why volunteers like myself had to deliver is the fact that doing this would be beyond the operational capacity. Canada had a hard time equipping our army with a dozen inflatable boats. So then you look at the ability to clothe, arm, 800,000 new troops in the last little while. So it has been a lot of friends, families, and everything else. I can tell you in the first couple of months of the war, Europe was picked clean in terms of body armor, uniforms, things like that. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of driving all over the place or waiting to hear that somebody just got a shipment yesterday and then driving up and immediately snapping it up. People have started to make their own. We looked at producing uniforms in the quantities. And so when I was talking to some Danish organization that wanted to volunteer, I said, we need meals ready to eat. They said, how many? I said, well, they need 1 million a day. I think that's the reality. And then people just hear that and they're just completely staggered by this because the logistics amount that is needed was a huge effort. And there's been a lot of people behind the scenes that are unsung heroes in terms of delivering this.
What has the performance of the Ukrainian government been like? Certainly in terms of the messaging and the morale boosting from President Zelensky, I think that's quite clear that there's been a pretty stark contrast to the sort of tired, staid propaganda coming from Vladimir Putin. But in terms of the performance, in terms of its ability to help the population during this difficult time, how has that performance been?
Well, helping the population largely depends on the local government. So you're talking about the quality of the municipal and regional authorities to be able to deliver in certain places.
Okay.
the fact is, the Sluga Naroda Party, the Servant of the People Party, was a new political party. So the amount of resources in terms of people that they had at their disposal to be able to mobilize at the start of the war was fairly limited. Unlike established political parties who have a huge basis of people within the organization that they can call on. And this is why we saw a number of people who had been appointed by the government turned out to be traitors, like down in Kherson and stuff like that. Because the fact is that the bodies that the Zelensky government could call on were not as extensive as a political party that has been around for 30 years would be. So one of the problems in terms of the human resources has been able to also ramp up the efforts. Also, they're very limited in terms of their budget. So in terms of the performance of the government, in terms of the government being able to run a fantastic, unprecedented PR campaign, absolutely amazing. In terms of things like preparing the education system to go back to school when your country's still under attack, that's been very difficult. And one of the reasons why is because the depth of people, new people within the ministry, right? So the problem is if you don't have a lot of experienced hands who have been through a number of crises dealing with this, whether it be health or education or things like that, would tax any government. I don't know how the Canadian government would react in a situation like this. Mm-hmm. If you're largely focused on PR efforts and things like that, when it comes down to an actual real crisis in which you need top-notch managers who are able to deliver, it becomes then very problematic. I mean, some point down the road, yes, this will be studied as somebody to do an analysis of effectiveness of public administration of Ukraine. But right now, I think it's a bit early to do sort of serious evaluations or functional reviews. Fact is, they're still around, so they win this one in terms of looking like a functional government and an effective government in comparison to what went on. And this is why when you look at Russia, my predictions before the invasion happened is that the invasion wouldn't happen because Russia didn't have the logistics and administrative capacity to undertake a large-scale war, which has proven exactly true. Right, so the whole issue right now is that Ukraine's administration has been able to deliver and defend the country. So already they've been stellar.
Well, you've made the segue into Russia, so let's keep that going. Former U.S. Ambassador Michael McFaul, commenting on the recent retreat of Russians in Kharkiv and elsewhere, said that this is the end of Putinism. I'm not going to pretend that if this is as simple an issue as that, but I'd like to sort of make that our launching point into our conversation.
Well, when you look at the history of authoritarian regimes, when they lose a war, usually ends up with the leader being, either in a spider hole or hung by his boots. Usually doesn't go very well. When your legitimacy is based on being the strong man and you're proved to be incredibly weak, how does that story usually end? Yep. Is there any resiliency in terms of the ability of the Russian government to survive this? No, because it's a brittle regime. So one strong hit like this, and we saw it exactly in the Soviet system, the loss of the war in Afghanistan was a great accelerator for the breakup of the Soviet Union because it just showed the level of incompetency. Putin's legitimacy has been based on stability. Russia is no longer a stable place. So the idea is that you give us your freedoms and we will make sure that you're safe, secure, and you have enough lattes to keep you going. Doesn't happen when the Starbucks is closed and you get the rotten burgers from the fake McDonald's and everything else. So the problem is now is that economic performance isn't there to create any sort of illusion that the country is going well. So the fact is that Putin's entire program, Putinism, has always been based on the fact of giving up civil liberties in exchange for some level of economic and security performance, and both of those are now down the toilet.
Well, that was the old Soviet social compact too, right?
Yeah, well, largely, yeah. Except they didn't
Yeah.
really deliver economically, and the right. The problem is that there is a very, very small middle class in Russia. So you have guys at the top, and you have the poor. The poor are now going to be destitute and being sent to the front. So how long are they going to put up? This system currently in place looks much more like 1917 than any time in the last 100 years.
Wow.
So Putinism is Tsar Nicholas II. Again, you have an autocratic country that can't perform. So yeah,
And what concerns me, and what I think the media really isn't talking about is, of course, many people would like to see Putin go. I'd be happy to see him go. I'd be delighted to see him go. You'd be delighted to see him go. But um, you know, I'm sure that you listen to Julia Davis, or you're on Twitter and you're getting her Russian media monitoring, where they're showing essentially psychotic individuals on Russian state TV, who are making the most outlandish statements that make Putin actually look like a moderate. And so what you have in Russia right now is you have Putin has pushed out a lot of the opponents to the war, people who believe the war was wrong in the first place, and has suppressed that through law, and through the law imprisoning people for up to 15 years. But of course, there's an encouragement of pro-war and anti-Ukrainian propaganda. So what concerns me is you have people who are who are speaking out even stronger than Putin has, who are calling for all kinds of crazy measures. So what I see is when Putin goes, unfortunately, that the replacement could possibly be worse than Putin himself. And that's something that the media just doesn't seem to be talking about. What are your thoughts on that?
yes. In any brutal authoritarian regime, anybody who is competent and poses an actual threat is eventually getting rid of. Are there any moderates left? No. Russian liberalism died with Boris Nemtsov. Russian liberals have proven themselves to be incredibly ineffective over the last 30 years. So where are those moderates going to come from? And this is a natural reaction. Who are the oppositionists in Russia? The oppositionists in Russia are the extreme right,
Right.
nationalists, some of whom supported Ukraine in 2014, simply because that they believed that Ukraine was on the right path to national determination and things like that. This has been the greatest threat to Russian power. Comes from two vectors. One is the ultra-right nationalists and the Islamicists, and essentially the Islamic radicals have either been sent off to Syria or been destroyed in numerous campaigns to de-radicalize Chechnya and elsewhere. So who's waiting in the wings to take over? My personal opinion on this is that Putin was a product of the intelligence service. He was a project. I was there in Moscow when he was appointed. Perhaps you remember Stepashin, the head of the National Committee, and he was also wanted to be put forward as president. Primakov was put forward. So it's clear that between Berezovsky and the intelligence service, Putin was their project. At what point did the intelligence service see that he no longer serves the purpose of stability that he was put in to create? So the internal threat, everybody's talking about oligarchs taking over, which is the most ridiculous thing of all. All Russian oligarchs come from Putin. Either you compromised yourself and bowed down to him, and that was the deal when he came in 1999. He said, either you're my creature or you're out, and that's it. They've all been pushed out. So anybody who has a dominant economic position owes everything only to Putin. Therefore, they're never going to rise up and give him a polonium milkshake. It's just not going to happen. So at what point does Putin no longer be a viable project for the elites when they look at the destruction of their army and potentially the destruction of their country? So there is that possibility that whoever comes in is going to be either a much clever intelligence agency that's going to look at rebuilding slowly Russia to back to where it was, or it's going to be somebody who's far more radically nationalistic, and there's going to be a massive bloodbath within Russia while they find out who is to blame for this debacle. Fact is, the destruction of its army is going to mean pretty much the destruction of the current regime. What comes after, we don't know. And this is one of the things that we thought would happen in April when the Battle of Kiev was lost, is that you would see the acceleration of the periphery in terms of regional entities then starting to stand up. And of course, you have China in the background. Russia's real enemy is China. And the fact that the Chinese have been playing the game now of they visited Kazakhstan yesterday, and making the point is that you don't need Russia. We'll guarantee your security. We'll be your best friend. And it's in China's interest to see the breakup of Russia. It becomes far easier to access the resources. So globally, what's going to happen? Destruction of Russian army, chaos in Russia, which may be much worse for the world in terms of violence and things like that. But also you're going to see collapse of Syria. You're going to see Africa in not only in a hunger state, but also in a massive wave of violence probably that's going to break out, because there are no other regional actors to step in at the moment. And you'll see the rise of, say, Turkey, the other hegemon, which is waiting in the wings. And Turkey's been playing a very interesting game between balancing between Ukraine and Russia.
In the last couple of minutes that we have left, now that you've given us that optimistic prognosis for world peace, I wanted to talk about a quote that I posted on my LinkedIn site a couple of days ago, and that was from one of the local councils in just outside of Moscow that have stated their objection and called for Putin's resignation, which in itself is almost unfathomable. And they say, in countries with regular turnover of power, people on average live better and longer than in those where the leader leaves office carried out in a box. I've done a number of podcasts. I mean, one of the things I'm concerned about is the state of democratic backsliding around the world, and I've done a number of podcasts on that issue. And one of the things I say is that people need to make that Democrats and people who believe in democracy have to make a more cogent argument for why democracies are so important in the world, why it's so much better, for lack of a better term, or more effective to be a democratic state. What's your view on that? Particularly in light of the fact that this argument is coming from elected officials at the municipal level in Russia itself.
Well, I mean, we don't know, because you would have to know who is behind this, right? Could be the loyal opposition, could be other people putting this out. But the fact is, yes, indeed, democracies are in retreat. What do we see? Populism on the rise everywhere. Populist governments are incredibly bad at governing. And so who does the Conservative Party of Canada elect? They elect a populist, right? So this is the model of Orban and other people who we see rise up, is that there is a direct link between populism and authoritarianism, which we see. Right, so this has been one of the great dangers that exists, is that these populist governments are going to come, and especially because the degree of social cohesion is so eroded after 2 years of the pandemic. Pandemic was a minor bump in the road, and what we see now is that the fact that governments couldn't react to this minor bump in the road in an effective manner doesn't predict what's going to come for a large-scale either economic or environmental crisis to hit us. More bad times are definitely coming, but unfortunately we have governments who are unprepared to effectively govern. Right?
Sorry, go ahead, Don.
No, so I mean, you just need to have the depth of experience and good managers. What we see around the world is you have two modes. You have populist governments, which don't really have experienced people who are in charge, and it's all about populism. Or you have these PR type governments, which everything is focused on their own ratings, and PR is the most important aspect of it, rather than actually governing. When we look at it in terms of experienced governing bodies that are able to weather a crisis, there's very few around the world.
A couple of just wrap up questions. One of them, just continuing on the same theme, is arguably you are an international expert on anti-corruption, and certainly New Brunswick's foremost. A little joke there. Certainly, it looks like Putin, who is thoroughly corrupt himself, of course, has really been smacked in the face from his own level of corruption. Or another way of putting it is the regime is crumbling under the corruption of its own weight. What are your views on that?
Yes, authoritarian regimes can actually be more effective in the initial stage in terms of curbing corruption because they're able to put people in jail. But long term, the golden rule in corruption is length of office term equals higher rates of corruption. You can actually show this by looking, for example, in the US at states that limit terms. If you have term limits, you have less corruption. You can show this by the level of prosecution and everything else. Longer you are in office, the higher the amount of corruption is going to occur. The other side of it is length of term that people think they're going to be in office. Short-term thinking leads to massive thefts. Yeah, if you're Mr. 2% and you know you're going to be around for 20 years, it's fine. If you don't know if you're going to be there in 6 months, you're going to become Mr. 25%. Again, you could look at numbers of regimes that have collapsed is when the level of misappropriation of resources reaches about 25%. 17 is at the border of stability. If you get above 17, then you start to see the regime crumble because there just isn't enough slop in the trough for the little piggies. So the elites will eventually rebel, and then you'll have some sort of popular uprising. And this is proven around the world. So length of time in office and level of access to resources to pilfer are two of the factors that greatly impact in terms of a regime and corruption. And there hasn't been that much work done on it. People always talk about populist things about corruption is bad and culture and whatever else. But the determining factor is simply about the amount of time that you have in the resources that are available and how easy it is to access those resources.
I'd like to get you back on for another episode just to talk about that issue. We'll do that another time. One last question, and we'll call this bonus content. So we'll officially end the podcast, and then we'll go into the bonus round, which is to say, because it's a bit of a preposterous question to ask you, assuming you would know the answer, who is responsible for the assassination of Daria Dugina?
Who knows? It was definitely an intelligence operation. One I can guarantee, it was no sort of free Russian army, or the absurd claims by the former member of parliament, Ponomarov, who's sitting in Kiev, who claimed this. It was definitely some sort of intelligence operation. Talking to people in the know, it's very doubtful that this was organized by the Ukrainians, because what do they win from this? Nothing. So there's no real tactical advantage to doing this. This was some sort of inside Russia deal. What its purpose or why they would do this belongs in many of the other mysteries. But I can tell you, if you look at the events over the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of defenestrations of people. People have been falling out of windows from Washington to Vladivostok.
Yes. Yeah.
So to me,
gotta tighten those windows.
Continuation, yes, of this defenestration is an old Eastern European tradition. But what we've seen is a greatly accelerated number of mysterious deaths over the last couple of weeks. Like Churchill said about Soviet politics, it's like two dogs fighting under a carpet. You can see the ripples, but you don't really know what's going on under the carpet.
That's a great place to end, Don. A lot of respect to you for your work. And, while I was worrying about Ukraine, you were out there doing something about it. You've got my profound respect for that. Slava Ukraini.
Thanks. I'm wearing my war Vyshyvanka. This is my new Vyshyvanka, not my Canadian flag one. I picked up a new one in Kiev, so it's my official war Vyshyvanka. I'll save the Canadian
Amazing.
one for Victory Day.
Perfect. Sounds
Right.
good.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. It's been fun.
Take care. Good to see you. All the best.
Okay. Thanks.
Hats off to Don Bowser. I really did the best I could to help the local community, the local Ukrainian community, and those that left Ukraine during the illegal Russian invasion. But look at Don Bowser. Unbelievable. Leaves the comfort of his own home, goes to a war zone to help in any way he can, or in any way he could. Hats off to Don. That is our podcast for today. Politics and Public Finance is produced and sponsored by Huge Impact Marketing. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, be sure to subscribe. I'm Jeff DeBro. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.